In the rebuttal period and in the question and answer period, we will all be working on the why of exactly why government attempts at fiscal stimulus don't work and will not work this time. What I'm going to do now is focus on a couple of historical examples showing the failure of government attempts at fiscal stimulus. The first major failure of stimulus was attempts by Herbert Hoover, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the Congresses of the 1930s to borrow and spend their way out of the Great Depression. Now, if you think about it for a moment, it's amazing how long the Great Depression of the 1930s lasted. At no point from 1930 to 1940 did the unemployment rate in America fall below 14%. Even though the real GDP figures indicate a partial recovery from 1934 to 1936, the reality is that per capita real GDP did not return to 1929 levels until 1939. No other recession in American history comes even close. Now, if you really want to believe that government stimulus spending is a good thing, you're going to try to argue that the reason the Great Depression lasted so long is that capitalism is inherently flawed and that capitalism just threw us a bad hand. And government then tried to do its best to get us out of it. That's what you're going to attempt to argue. But that narrative does not jibe with the historical facts. There were a few recessions before the Great Depression which started off nearly as bad as the downturn that began in 1930. For example, the unemployment rate during the Depression of the 1890s reached 18%. That was not as high as the 24% that reached in 1933, but this is a time when people were 40 years poorer than they were in 1933. Also, the 1933 rate was pushed up, and we can talk about this, by job owning and the high wages policies of Herbert Hoover. The monetary collapse, for another example, that triggered the 1920 to 1922 recession was a monetary collapse. Wholesale prices fell by 44% in 5 quarters from 1920 to 1921. That's quite a bit further than the price level fall at the beginning of the Great Depression, which was only 31%. For another indicator of another earlier recession, there was a 14% decline in GDP in 1893 and 1894. There was a 13% decline in 1908. Those were pretty close to the 16% decline that started off the Great Depression in the first 2 years of that depression. Those earlier recessions all had the potential to be as bad as the Great Depression of the 1930s, but they weren't. And there was one important difference. In the earlier recessions, the government did not engage in fiscal stimulus. The government did not engage in widespread interventions. The reason the Great Depression of the 1930s lasted so long and the reason unemployment was so bad was largely due to the effects of government stimulus spending. One of those effects, and it was a deliberately intended effect at the time, was to prop up wages. That leads, when people are looking hard for work and you artificially hold up wages, that leads to greater unemployment of labor, the greatest unemployment we've ever had in this country. It also leads to reduced inputs to other productive factors. And as Joe's going to help us explain, the New Deal stimulus spending prolonged the Great Depression by stealing money from the long-term productive capacity of the country and sort of front-loading that into consumption spending. That's the whole focus of GDP that the Keynesians are obsessed with. Herbert Hoover and Congress, starting in 1931, ran up deficits more than anybody had ever done in peacetime in this country. We gave a good college try for that stimulus. Total government outlays in 1930 were 13% of GDP. 2 years later, they're 21%. They didn't drop below 19% until 1940, and then they kept going. The cheerleaders for fiscal stimulus, including a lot of people, unfortunately, with PhDs in this country, have routinely failed to explain why the Great Depression lasted so long if all this New Deal taxing, spending, and borrowing was all that great. Another example, Japan's lost decade. These guys tried macroeconomic fiscal stimulus spending in spades. Japan passed 10 fiscal stimulus bills. They spent $1.4 trillion dollars in U.S. dollars, current U.S. dollars, $1.4 trillion in a country that is half the population of ours and whose economy is 1/3 the size of ours. So you can't say that Japan, during its lost decade, in which basically their GDP only grew by 1% a year, you can't say that they didn't try stimulus. They sure did. They also, like our central bank, they loaned billions, tens of billions of US dollars equivalent to banks and companies in order to try to recapitalize them. That's what Paulson and Geithner have been up to. It hasn't worked. So what I would tell you is looking at the biggest attempts in history that we can reach to, looking at the biggest attempts at stimulus, they didn't work. Thank you.